Let me begin by telling you something that you already know, even if you haven't consciously thought about it. There is something not quite right with how we have organized our society. I'm not saying that there is nothing good or true or beautiful in how our society functions. What I am saying is that there is a crookedness, a misalignment, a pathology somewhere deep within the foundations of our social systems and institutions. Here's what I mean. Much of our society is organized in a way that makes us live and act against our innate dispositions, against our true nature. No wonder we are so stressed, so anxious, so depressed. No wonder we don't feel at home. If this painting resonates with you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We don't feel at home because we are in a state of exile. We feel that way because we live and act, for the most part, in ways that don't bring us satisfaction or joy. And that's not an individual problem that we can solve with therapy. It's a collective problem, so much so that we think of it not as a problem, but as part of the human condition. But it's not inevitable. It's the result of how we have designed our social systems and institutions. So we are in a state of exile, but the good news is that we are not lost. We know where the home is, and we have access to many pathways that can take us back to where we belong. I'm here today because I want to introduce you to one of these pathways. But first, let's look at our current predicament, our state of exile. There's a long-standing debate about human nature. It asks the following question: what kind of creatures are we? Are we like this, or are we like that? Are human beings naturally aggressive or naturally compassionate? Are we inherently selfish or inherently cooperative? Are we greedy or generous, wicked or virtuous, corrupt or wholesome? This binary choice may seem problematic. You might say, we are some combination of both. And to some extent, I would have to agree. People are obviously capable of both types of behavior. We are capable of extreme acts of violence and cruelty, just as we are capable of extreme acts of kindness and sacrifice. But that's not what the debate is about. The debate is about which of these two sides represents our innate disposition, our essential nature, our true home. Regardless of whether or not we have consciously thought about this debate, the fact is that all of us are carrying within our minds certain assumptions about human nature. And these assumptions are implicated in how we live and act in the world. We have these assumptions because, while the debate goes on, we have to live and act in the world. which involves interacting with other people. Interacting with other people requires at least a working hypothesis regarding what sort of creatures we are dealing with. So, in the process of growing up, we acquire a set of assumptions about human nature, about who we are as a species. People's assumptions about human nature can vary from one society to another, but within any given society, they tend to persist over time. That's because such assumptions are an element of culture. And like other elements of culture, they are transmitted from one generation to the next. They are part of conventional wisdom, part of what a culture considers common sense. Now, despite the fact that human beings are capable of both types of behavior, it so happens that our culture, on the whole and for the most part, has chosen the left-hand side of the debate over the right-hand side. We know this because a great deal of how our social systems and institutions function would make sense only if we assume a dark and pessimistic view of who we are as a species. Our society's conventional wisdom, our culture's common sense, tells us that human beings are essentially aggressive, selfish, and greedy. We are competitive by nature. We are born with a strong inclination toward wickedness and corruption. Much of our society is built on that assumption. We believe that if we are left to our own devices, we would do horrible things to each other, which is why we have accepted the necessity of coercion. It makes sense to us that children must be socialized through shame and guilt and fear, that our justice system has to be based on punishment, that the only way to deal with violence is through unleashing more violence, that without constant surveillance, students will cheat and employees won't do their jobs. Since we believe that we cannot be trusted to make good choices, we have accepted the necessity for top-down control of our own behavior. That's why our institutions are hierarchically organized, and that's why even our democracy is under significant constraints. That's also why we think that social problems are best solved through legislation. Because people will only act in their own self-interest, with little or no regard for others, the only way to ensure right conduct is by making and enforcing more and more laws and regulations. We find it perfectly reasonable that Big Brother should watch our every move and must catch us when we transgress, because otherwise we would all find ourselves in a state of constant tension and conflict. We fear that society would fall apart without coercive and punitive mechanisms. I know that I am exaggerating in order to make my point, but not too much. Conservatives and liberals do not disagree that human beings are essentially selfish and competitive and greedy. They disagree only about the best way of managing that reality. You can probably think of countless examples, perhaps from your own experience, that seem to prove this dark and pessimistic view of human nature. But I would like to suggest another possibility. What if our culture's common sense view of who we are actually functions as a self-fulfilling prophecy? if we expect other people to be selfish, it makes sense for us to preemptively start acting in the same way. Other people notice our selfish behavior and decide that it is in their own best interest to act selfishly as well. This behavioral choice then becomes proof that people are naturally and inherently selfish, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. From there, we draw the logical conclusion that we cannot trust anyone because everyone is out to get us. That our only responsibility is to guard our own narrowly defined self-interest. And whenever possible, we must exploit other people because that's exactly what they are going to do if they get a chance. There have always been people who noticed that our culture's common sense view of human nature was not convincing. And so they tried challenging this view and argued for a more optimistic picture of human nature. In the past, however, it was possible to ignore such voices, but not anymore. Scientists from a variety of disciplines have been looking into this issue for a while. And about 20 years ago, their cumulative findings reached a sort of tipping point. As a result, the debate over human nature is coming to an end. The tide is turning. The story is changing. Because we now have a much more empirical and evidence-based understanding of the kind of creatures we are. The emerging view is incredibly positive. It gives us very good reasons to feel optimistic about improving human behavior. There is a virtual flood of both academic and popular books on this subject, and all of them are telling us that our society's conventional wisdom about human nature, the view that underlies much of our social systems and institutions, is seriously flawed. Aggression, selfishness, and greed are not inscribed in our genes or hardwired into our brains. The exact opposite is true. This ongoing shift has wide-ranging implications for all of us. If our culture's basic understanding of who we are is wrong, then it means that all those aspects of our social systems and institutions that we have built on the basis of that understanding are also seriously flawed. That's precisely why we don't feel at home. We don't feel at home because our world is organized in a way that requires us to live and act against our innate dispositions and our true nature. That's what I mean when I say that we are in a state of exile. So what are we supposed to do? Let me tell you what we are not supposed to do. We are not supposed to adapt ourselves so that we could better fit within this upside-down world. We are supposed to put the world right side up so that it comes into alignment with the kind of creatures we are. Once we realize that, we face the daunting challenge of transforming our social systems and institutions in fundamental ways. This would involve a shift from top-down hierarchical structures to those based on participation and cooperation. This sounds like a really difficult undertaking, and I agree, it is. But I've already given you the good news. We are in exile, but we are not lost. We know where the home is, and we also have access to many, many pathways that can take us back to where we belong. One such pathway is called prosocial, and that's what I would like to talk about next. So, what is prosocial? The purpose of prosocial is to help any team, organization, or community to become more equitable and collaborative. While simultaneously increasing the group's overall effectiveness and the well-being of its individual members. Prosocial is both a scientifically grounded conceptual framework and a comprehensive practical program for increasing participation and cooperation, both within and between groups. There is a worldwide community of facilitators who are applying this approach in a variety of different settings. As a conceptual framework, prosocial has emerged through a synthesis of 3 different research streams coming from 3 different disciplines. Research stream number 1 is coming to us from evolutionary science. It brings us Darwin's basic framework as refined and expanded through multi-level selection theory and applied cultural evolution. The most important contributions in this area have been made by David Sloan Wilson. Research stream number 2 is coming to us from behavioral science. This research stream brings with it the relational frame theory, or RFT, and acceptance and commitment therapy, or training, better known as ACT. The most important contributions in this area have been made by Stephen Hayes. Research stream number 3 is coming to us from social science. It brings us the core design principles for the successful management of common pool resources. These principles were first identified by Elinor Ostrom. So, what do these 3 research streams contribute to prosocial? From evolutionary science, we learn that change happens through variation, selection, and retention within a given context or environment, and that the same process that drives genetic and epigenetic evolution also drives behavioral and cultural evolution. Because the individual organism is not the only unit of evolution, natural selection can, under the right conditions, favor the emergence of cooperation and altruism, both within groups and between groups. All of these insights have real-world applications, for it is possible for any team, organization, or community to deliberately guide its own behavioral and cultural evolution in the direction that it finds most desirable. Next, consider behavioral science. We have known for a long time that a great deal of learning or behavior change happens through operant conditioning, and that aversive control of behavior is much less effective than appetitive control. Now, thanks to contextual behavioral science, which is an emerging school within the behaviorist tradition, we have learned that the nature of human language is such that it can generate its own contingencies in the form of relational operands that can significantly modify the effects of other operands. We know that only 6 core processes are involved in creating psychological flexibility, which is absolutely necessary for any conscious behavior change. Finally, from the revolutionary research by Elinor Ostrom, we have learned that the tragedy of the commons is not inevitable by any means, and that we have a wonderful option for organizing social systems and institutions that involves neither top-down regulation nor free market individualism. For thousands of years, communities around the world have successfully and equitably managed their common pool resources by following a few design principles. These principles have been thoroughly studied and documented. What Ostrom's research implies is that any team, organization, or community can adapt and implement the same design principles and thereby create a social environment that would limit selfishness and enhance collaboration. Now, what do we get when we bring these 3 research streams into conversation with each other? What we get is something new and very, very exciting. We get a scientifically grounded theory that tells us exactly how we can evolve the culture of a group by helping its members increase their psychological flexibility so they can align their behavior with the design principles necessary for maximizing collaboration. That's prosocial as a conceptual framework. And what do we get when we add one more ingredient by asking an organizational psychologist, Paul Atkins, to join the conversation and help apply this theory in real-world situations? What we get is a comprehensive, yet flexible, practical program for creating productive, equitable, and collaborative groups. What does a prosocial group look like? Or perhaps a better question would be, what does it feel like to be part of a prosocial team, a prosocial organization, a prosocial community? For a group to qualify as prosocial, it must meet certain criteria. Even though they can differ widely in their nature, composition, context, and purpose, all prosocial groups are similar in fundamental ways, since they share certain basic characteristics. These characteristics emerge when the individual members of a group practice particular forms of behavior on a regular basis. The behaviors in question can be grouped in different categories, so that each category represents the embodiment of a particular principle. From Ostrom's research, we know that there are 8 such principles, none of which is dispensable. These are called core design principles, since the failure to implement even one of these principles is enough to disqualify a group from being prosocial. To get a sense of the culture within a prosocial group, let's consider the 8 core design principles, or CDPs. you would notice that the principles are very general. That's because they are meant to be applicable in all sorts of different situations and contexts. As I briefly describe each principle, try to imagine what it would feel like to participate in a team, organization, or community whose members are committed to putting that principle into practice. CDP-1 is shared purpose and identity. The members of a prosocial group understand the purpose of the group and find it worthy of their time and effort. The group is a strong source of their identity. There is pride in belonging to the group, and there is joy in working together. CDP-2 is equitable distribution of contributions and benefits. For all the members of a prosocial group, the balance between what they give and what they receive is fair and acceptable. There is no exploitation or free riding. No one takes advantage of anyone else. CDP-3 is fair and inclusive decision-making. All members of a prosocial group are involved in the making of any decisions that affect them, especially the decisions about how decisions are made. Everyone knows on the basis of their own experience that their values, concerns, and interests matter. CDP-4 is monitoring of agreed behavior. Members of a prosocial group notice and care about each other's behavior. Everyone in the group is aware of what others are doing. Transparency is highly valued. All relevant information is regularly shared. CDP-5 is graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behavior. In a prosocial group, individuals provide feedback by responding to each other's behavior. This includes sanctions for unhelpful behavior and celebration of helpful behavior. CDP-6 is fast and fair conflict resolution. A prosocial group recognizes that conflict is inevitable in any collective enterprise, which is why it establishes specific procedures for equitable and effective resolution of internal conflicts. Everyone is encouraged and empowered to express their grievances. CDP-7 is authority to self-govern. A prosocial group enjoys sufficient autonomy so it can govern itself according to the first 6 principles, without being constrained by excessive interference from external authorities. CDP-8 is collaborative relations with other groups. A prosocial group seeks to establish collaborative and equitable relationships with other groups, and it does so on the basis of the same principles that it applies internally. As you can see, the first 6 principles help increase collaboration within the group. The 7th principle prevents too much external interference so that the group can manage its own affairs according to its own understanding of these principles. And the 8th principle is needed to ensure that collaboration happens not just within a group, but also between groups and between groups of groups. Obviously, it is not enough to just know these principles. Putting them into practice requires conversations and imagination and, above all, psychological flexibility. And that's why contextual behavioral science is a necessary component of prosocial. Prosocial is not a management fad. I see it as a powerful approach for bringing our social systems and institutions in alignment with our innate dispositions, our true nature. Prosocial is not the only pathway that can take us from where we are to where we need to be. But what makes it remarkable is that both the theory and the practice of prosocial are firmly grounded in empirical science.